It is an honor for me to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Benji Carlson from the Stockholm University, Sweden, and our invited guest and discussant, Professor Ajailu Newmai from the University of Hyderabad, India. We have circulated the details of Professor Ajailu and Professor Carlson well in advance, so I will not be going into the details of their work, but I certainly would like to acknowledge that they are remarkable scholars and are at the cutting edge research when it comes to indigenous people or tribals, particularly in the Indian context. And we're very fortunate and honorable to have both of them in our conference. Thank you very much for your presence. And with this note, I invite Professor Carlson to please take over.
So you can see the screen?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Okay. So, well, many thanks for this generous introduction and many thanks for the invitation to participate in this timely and highly relevant conference on indigenous knowledge and climate change. It's indeed a great pleasure and honor, and I would like to extend my gratitude to the organizers, most of all Dr. Longshibeni Kitan, whom I've been in contact with for organizing this, and her colleagues at the Department of Folkloristic and Tribal Studies. Thanks, of course, also to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Satyanandran, and the Acting Vice Chancellor, Professor Alagwadi, and Professor the Dean of the Faculty, Professor John. And further, of course, also to the faculty and students at the Central University of Karnataka. It's really wonderful to be part of this, and of course, it would have been a double pleasure if I would have been able to be there in person. I hope that will happen at a later point. As an outsider and a non-Indigenous person, I'm somewhat hesitant to talk about Indigenous knowledge. And I will come to this kind from the sideways, sticking to the few things that I have worked on and feel some confidence to talk about. And here I'm really thankful to have Professor Ajailu Newmai from the University of Hyderabad as discussant. And she's a leading scholar in the fields of migration, gender, and human rights. And I think I'm really confident that she will sort of correct me or push me in some of the things that I will address, and perhaps she has other ideas about these things. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation as well. So before I start, let me just mention that I speak from Stockholm, Sweden. And as we will address Indigenous people's issues in these coming days, I would like to mention that the Sami people, the Indigenous people of Sweden, and not only Sweden, but also the neighboring countries, Norway, Finland, and also parts of Russia. I mean, so I would like to acknowledge their presence here in Sweden. And Sweden has always maintained sort of a high grounds when it comes to human rights issues on the international arena. But domestically, Sweden continued to deny the Sami people full recognition as Indigenous peoples. And sadly, Sweden, for example, is still not ratified the ILO Convention number 169, a convention that grants some kind of protection or rights of ancestral territories. So there are logging, mining, water, hydro projects, and most recently wind farms that intrude on and disturb the lives and livelihoods of the Sami people. And this is something that we can perhaps also come back to later on. So, as mentioned, in my talk, I will concentrate on something that I've been working on more recently in Northeast. I mean, I've been concentrating on Northeast India for the last, most of my academic life, at least for the last 20 years. And then mainly working on things like ethnicity, identity formation, self-determination, and conflicts over land and natural resources. I also carried out a recent project on migration together with my colleague and friend, Dr. Dolly Keegan at Melbourne University, where we followed young migrants from Northeast Indian uplands to the metropolitan cities of South India, Bangalore, also Mumbai and some other cities. And this has resulted in a monograph called Leaving the Land. I think I will have that. Sorry. Yeah, so you see so it resulted in this monograph, Leaving the Land, Indigenous Migration and Effective Labor in India. It came out with Cambridge University Press, I think it was 2 years ago, 1 year ago. Since then, I'm partly, and also as a response to this work, I've been mainly looking at plants these last 2 years. And I've been sort of drawn to plants, and as you know, the title of this talk, Thinking with Plants, I will explore this new interest of mine. And let me just start then by saying, you know, why plants? I mean, we are, after all, I'm an anthropologist and social scientist. So why looking at plant, and why looking at plant now? And I think to begin with, and I would just like to say that, I mean, after working with sort of this political ecology framework for some time, looking at conflicts, how different conflicts over nature and nature turned into a resource that different actors trying to claim, appropriate a claim or assert rights over. And while this type of work still is extremely important, we know that mines are being opened, forests are being cleared. So this type of work is still highly relevant. But I felt somehow the need to open my scholarly practice for other ways of engaging with the myriad of forms of life that we are surrounded by and ultimately depend on for our survival. So I mean, I think this happens to many of us, you know, that it's not, certain themes might still be relevant, but we feel that our own engagement with these are somehow become exhausted. But so this turned then to these other forms of life, nature not as a resource, but a living, consisting of various living beings. And I mean, that turn is not something that I'm only myself have been going in that direction. We see during the last couple of years or last decade, and particularly in my own field of anthropology, a large number of scholars addressing these issues. It's a tremendously rich scholarship emerging that centers around lives and life worlds of animals, insects, and plants, and how these are entangled with human beings. This goes commonly under the rubric of multi-species or more than human anthropology. This is in the field of anthropology, but there are also similar trends going on in related fields of you know, sometimes we talk about the environmental humanities. And I'm very especially happy to see that Dr. Sophie Zhao will be speaking tomorrow, a scholar that is doing fantastic work in this field. When it comes to plants, one of my own, I'm very much indebted to the pioneering work of Natasha Myers, another anthropologist, who's also coined the term planthropology. I have to see, and I'll try to shift. So Natasha Myers, she's also been working on with photographs, trying to sort of capture the movement and the aesthetics of nature. This is just an example of her work, but she's also developed various sort of concepts in relation to plant, and also, I mean, she coined the term planthropology, but she also coined the term planthropocene, you know, trying to twist this idea about the present time is Anthropocene. And so this, I'm sort of feel drawn to this type of work, and really it's an inspiring field with as I said, a lot of really exciting work coming out during the last years. And another reason for turning to plants for me was that during the work together with Dolly on these young migrants who spend, you know, the time in these large cities of southern India, it was. I mean, we learned about, you know, I mean, a lot of these migrants was really obsessed by getting hold of plants and food items from home, and cooking and eating food together with fellow brothers and sisters from the Northeast was a very central activity in the leisure time. So it became a kind of a metabolic embodiment of the ancestral soil and homes, life back home. And most of these young migrants told that they wanted a life outside of the hardships of subsistence farming. Yet it was through food and certain heritage crops they seemed to build an intimate relation with the land and their respective communities back home. This was also something that they shared with friends in the city that belonged to other Northeastern communities. This then has pushed us into a new project about food sovereignty. I'm trying to. A new project on food sovereignty, where you dealing with what you plant and what you eat. And this is then about staying on the land, or returns, people that return from living outside of their home and returning, and how they build that a new livelihood back home. And the working, and in my case, the focus will be on heritage crops in this new project. And one of the working hypotheses that we work is that a lot of indigenous sovereignty will focus more and more, and this is something that happens internationally, but I think we are looking at this in particular context of Eastern Himalaya, but the idea that indigenous sovereignty will increasingly concern or revolve around aspects of food sovereignty. And this is something that I will come back to in a while. But before that, I come to this, I need to point to another reason for why plants have become so important at this juncture for me. And this was by mere chance, my encounter with Assam tea growing in Kenya. So if you allow me, I will, in the remaining, I will start talking about tea, the tea plant, and then to come back to this issue about heritage crops and food sovereignty that I'm working at present. And it might appear as a strange thing to talk about tea in this context about indigenous knowledge and climate change. But as we will see, this is indeed highly relevant in this context. Yeah. So, so during my first year in India, this was 89-90, when I spent 1 year at the North Bengal University as a visiting doctoral student. There were several projects going on relating to tea garden laborers in North Bengal, in the Duars area. And some of the senior professors tried to convince me that I should also join the project and look at tea garden laborers. But for some reasons, I declined that then. But so I've been sort of, and since then I've been traveling through northern Bengal, but also Assam, and I've been surrounded by tea estates, and I've been I've been spending most of my time in and around tea gardens, but I've never really thought that this was a theme for me to look more into. And of course, we have Professor Virginijus Kaka on the program coming out, and his work really stands out as one of the leading scholars on tea and the tea plantation system in India. And I just show you here one of his recent articles when that came out in EPW recently, where he calls for a complete restructuring of the tea plantation system in India. And there is also, if you're interested in this, there is also an accompanying interview you find they have sort of an online site called Engage, where you can learn about his process and how he sort of, he is a scholar, but he's also grown up in a tea plantation. So he has both the inside and the outside view of the conditions for tea garden laborers. And as we all know, this is a very sad story of how people was brought from central or eastern India to work in the plantations in Assam and North Bengal. But along with Professor Kaka, there is also a number of other scholars, not least historians like Amalendo Guha and Jayita Sharma, that's done excellent work on the tea plantations and tea gardens in India. So I suppose I always felt that there was no reason for me to enter this field of scholarship, that we had so much excellent work going on already. But it was when I, in 2014, traveled or moved to Kenya with my family because of my wife's work. And during a weekend visit to a tea plantation, I was completely taken by the information, the lady who was running this sort of lunch place where people came out in the weekends to visit the tea plantation. And she just, has a small sort of information telling people and said that all tea in Kenya comes from, is Assam tea. I thought, wow, this is interesting. How did the tea plant travel to Kenya, to East Africa? So I just felt that, okay, it's time for tea for me as well now. So this is something I really have to look into. So I managed to get, and again, you know, tea in Kenya is the largest export crop. And it's also, I mean, huge parts of the highlands are covered by tea plants. And of course, there are plenty of work on how plants have been traveled across the world. But I really strongly felt that this is a story where, you know, the path has been crossed for me. So I really need to look at how the tea plant traveled from Assam over the Indian Ocean to East Africa and made African soil its home. So I got a small project grant on a project together with some Indian and Kenyan colleagues, a project we call Assam Tea Kenya. And I have published two things on this, which if anyone is interested, the one is in a book called Seed Waste that I've edited with a colleague when we are looking at seeds, you know, various aspects of seeds. And of course, seeds are tremendously interesting to think about. And it was seeds that planters, I mean, settlers, white settlers brought from Assam to East Africa that, you know, that started the whole tea industry in Kenya. And the other one is a new article that came out recently in Geoforum, when I'm sort of thinking about this movement of the travel of the tea plant from Assam to East Africa. And in this letter, Geoforum, this is part of a special issue where we try to think with James Scott's work, his book Against the Grain, and thinking about sort of aspects of crops, sort of inherent aspects of crops and how they can be sort of part of state formation, and in my case, you know, the imperial aspects. Yeah. So in these two papers, then I struggled with a number of thorny and tricky questions about the tea plant, how the tea plant so successfully could be turned into a plantation crop, the plasticity of the plant, allowing for plant breeding and high yielding varieties, and how climate change with increasing temperatures and more erratic rainfall patterns now have start making the monoculture plantation increasingly vulnerable. And as tea researchers, both in Kenya and India, told me, the success of increasing production through high-yielding clones, uniform fields for genetically identical plants, is now hitting back. And the challenge today is how to bring new diversity into the plantation. And with this, we're actually back full circle to the jungles of Assam, where the British, as the story goes, discovered tea growing wild in the early 19th century. And the fact here is that tea was actually grown in the wild, or growing in forest gardens by Singapore people and a number of other indigenous communities in the hills. So you could, if you put it differently, you could say that tea was an agroforestry crop. Yeah. And it's this journey with tea I have come to think about as a story of decolonizing tea, how to liberate the tea from the plantation. And this is a picture from Mr. Manjenda, who our research team visited in Assam, and he's running a small eco lodge and a small tea garden, where he's producing this famous smoky Singapore tea called Palap. And as we were sitting on the veranda of this eco lodge, he told us about, Mr. Mayala told about the painful history of the Singapores, how the British discovered the tea, brought disaster to his community, and how they rebelled against the British, but eventually, rebelled against the British confiscation of the land, and how they even cut down tea trees to avoid coming under, this sort of that the land would be taking over. And yet, as the slogan of the leaflet that Manjala gave us for his Singapore Heritage tea, so the slogan on this leaflet said, "Where there is Palap, there is hope." but I cannot go into the details about the Singapore encounter with the British and how the lands were appropriated and handed over to British planters. But what I would like to highlight here is, or draw attention to, is the fact that tea was being grown by indigenous peoples in these parts of India, as well as adjoining areas of Yunnan, China, Burma, and other parts of Southeast Asia. Basically the highlands that we James Scott and William Van Chantal know as the Somia. As far as I know, the Simpus are no longer cultivating tea in the forest. But I know that I've heard that and in this image, I forgot to say that, in this image, Manjula showed us a tea tree growing wild. So in the middle there, you see it's a bit difficult to identify it, but he had told us that, yeah, most of the tea trees around in this area in the forest had been cut down because it's a very valuable wood, but there are a few examples left. And he took us out just outside his tea estate, in the forest, and showed us this tea tree in the middle. And I know there are also other parts of Northeast where you supposedly can find, tea trees growing in the wild. But as far as, as I said, I don't know if any of these indigenous communities produce it in a more systematic way, as before. But there are indeed areas of this Somia where you have tea still being grown in the forest. And here I'm very impressed by the work by ethnobotanist and plant scientist, Dr. Salena Ahmed from Tufts University. And she and her team have been carrying out long-term research on the traditional agroforest cultivation among the Aka and other indigenous communities in Yunnan. And as Ahmed points to in a number of publications, by growing tea in the forest, along with other trees and surrounding vegetation, the Aka can produce tea without use of pesticides or fertilizers. A production, and they can, the production is also much more resilient to longer periods of drought, and they can, cope better with storms and heavy rainfall. And the multi-layered canopy with diverse vegetation becomes a buffer protecting the tea against, various diseases and pests. And the tea they produce, the famous pu'er tea, has become a highly prized commodity during last decades. But despite this, successes of the, this is from a tea plantation among the Aka. You see the richness of the vegetation and then the mixed canopy, and so it's grown along with other trees and of course also, just forest. But yet, the Chinese state is still encouraging people to turn into sort of the monoculture form of tea production, where you have high-yielding clones planted from cuttings. They've been pursuing that for the last couple of decades. But for the Aka, their heritage tea is a source of culture, pride, and identity, as well as a source of income. Tea seeds are freely exchanged in the community, which again secure a high genetic diversity in the forest gardens. So to cut this very long story short, what you find here is both the origin and the future of tea taken out of the plantation. And as a final point about tea, the British early on was aware of the vulnerability of the monoculture plantation. It was a daily struggle to keep unwanted pests and diseases out of the plantation. And in the back of the minds of the planter community was the experience of the coffee industry on Ceylon, or today Sri Lanka. Once a very lucrative industry that was completely wiped out by the so-called coffee roast. So they had this, the fear of something similar happening to the tea industry in Assam. And in the late 19th century, where, really the tea plantation system somehow, was peaking, and they almost had started overtaking Chinese export of tea. The planters became increasingly worried about the different diseases in the plantation. So they called on the government to, and the government brought in the famous botanist, Sir George Watt. And after a 3-month field investigation, where Watt traveled across Assam's tea country, he submitted this report that you see here. It's a voluminous report where he argues that the main cause of the trouble was that the tea plant had been kept in an unnatural state in the plantation. And I quote, the plant had been deprived of the power of flowering and fruiting and was not allowed to rest, and that it had been deprived of the shade and association with other plants. And as he put it, the success of increasing yields had come to the price of keeping the plant in a diseased state that made it vulnerable or predisposed to various diseases. He noted further that none of the pests or diseases could be found in tea stands growing in the wild. Unwittingly then, Watt recommended the type of agroforest tea cultivation on the indigenous communities, which contemporary scientists like Serena Ahmed and her team now bring attention to as the future path for tea. So you see here, so I find the story of tea, brings so many relevant points also to when we then turn to other aspects, other plants outside of the plantation. So one of the lessons, and now I turn to sort of after the plantation, one of the lessons here is to call for a complete rethinking of the monoculture plantation form. Yet, as we know, plantations are expanding all over the world, and especially in the global south. Be it soybean productions in Southern America and Africa, or oil palm plantations in Indonesia and other parts of Asia. As anthropologist Tanya Murray-Lee aptly points, these enormous plantations are death zones, destroying local environments and livelihoods of a large number of people. Sophie Chow has, in a series of recent articles, and I guess this is something she will talk about tomorrow, and also something that comes out in her forthcoming book, In the Shadow of the Palms, Modern Human Becomings in West Papua. She shows in these publications how the indigenous Marian community tried to navigate the destruction and changing landscape brought along with the oil palm. But she also, her work is extremely rich. One of the things I really love is how she points to how the Marian people relate to the oil palm itself. And they talk about the plant, that it avoids relations with others. It lacks responsibility, concerns for others. The oil palm has few friends and like to be alone. It's something that she writes in a 2018 paper. And it's interesting to note here that the oil palm is also, this is one of her images from Indonesia. You see this type of monoculture plantation. But it's also interesting to see that the oil palm is being introduced to Northeast India, promoted by the state, with all kinds of, there are, you get plants, and I think there is also schemes where you get some kind of various forms of support. And it seems, so it's promoted with high, it's celebrated, and it's supposed to be increased the self-sufficiency of oil in food oil in India. But I mean, what I read from those who have already tried oil palm, there are various types of difficulties for people. And I read one article about a farmer who had oil palm for some time, a decade almost, and he was really, it didn't work. It was difficult to harvest. There was no really market yet for the produce. And he decided to sort of get rid of the oil palms and try to kill the tree. But he said it was almost impossible to try to burn the oil palms, but that was very difficult. So in his case, it was even difficult to get rid of the oil palm once it was there. And in the case of Meghalaya, where I've been doing most of my work, there has been a strong opposition against introducing the oil palm. So for example, the Khasi Student Union has issued a ban on oil palm in the state. So this is a story that I find very interesting to follow. So here I'm coming over to my second theme of the talk, dealing with food sovereignty and heritage plans. And for me, this is sort of it's about exploring alternatives to the plantation and to remind about other ways of being in the world and of inhabiting the planet, where one recognizes the presence of other living beings with their own agency and point of view. So plants then are not only a matter of food, but also about more intimate relations of care and kinship, something we learn from indigenous communities around the world. So heritage crops. During recent years, one can notice a lot of attention internationally around what is often talked about as indigenous food systems. The United Nations and Food and Agriculture Organization, for example, has established a global hub on indigenous people's food system, stating that the global hub will promote the preservation of indigenous people's territorial management practices and food systems that have fed indigenous peoples for centuries, while preserving 80% of the remaining biodiversity on the planet. This is a quote from the global hub on the web page. So central here is the issue of food security under conditions of climate change and wider questions of sustainable development and long-term well-being for people and the planet. And also regionally, in the case of Northeast India and Eastern Himalayas more generally, we can that we are concerned with in this new project that I mentioned earlier. We can see both an interest in indigenous food systems among development agents and also among community and grassroots organizations are involved in preserving and reviving traditional crops and cultivation of traditional crops as part of a wider attempt to build local food security under conditions of climate change, something which is already a reality in especially upland areas. And millet is one of these crops that often is mentioned in these contexts. It's identified as being of particular relevance. And the organization Northeastern Network, for example, a regional organization, is supporting Naga villages' work to revive and promote the cultivation of millet. A crop with significant nutritious value that can be cultivated successfully under more uncertain climate conditions, well suited then to soils and with various cultural significance for a lot of the upland people. So millet is one of the crops that I plan to follow and see how these attempts to revive the cultivation of millet happens. And here, of course, when we look at various organizations that are involved in activities, of course, what you read on and in different leaflets, in this case, like in newspaper articles, you might get an idea that this is happening all over Northeast India, for example. But realities are often different from what is projected by organizations. So my plan then is to follow a lot of these different stories and organizations involved in this and see what actually goes on the ground. And here I found it's very interesting to look at, so this is a sort of a baseline study that Dr. Longshibeni and a team of scholars from Utkal University have been carrying out, where they have been looking at 5 different ethnic communities in Nagaland and what they grow and the various conditions of agriculture in Nagaland. And what we get here is a rather complex and varied situation. Differences depending on if it's higher altitude areas, if it's in the plains, depending on if the communities live nearby urban area or if it's more sort of rural places. But just to give you an example, in the Tuasang district, they note that in recent times, there's been accommodation of commercial crops like cardamom as well as different varieties of peas, cottage cabbages, and potatoes. So, but despite this introduction of new crops, people pursue numerous indigenous varieties of crops that are grown in home gardens and home fields. Of the 120 households investigated in this district, they found that a bit over 50% had plantation of commercial crops, especially then cardamom. But something that also was, which was also promoted by the state agriculture department. And due to warmer climate, several upland farmers have also started growing, have stopped growing Job's tears on higher altitude and turn instead to certain new paddy varieties. That, that since the climate became warmer, the paddy could grow also well on high altitudes. Several of the farmers told that they left Job's tears as it was such a labor-intensive task of pounding the crop. Other farmers pointed to the superiority of indigenous varieties, not least to the aroma and the flavor of the food that somehow get a sense of, gave them a sense of home. So it was a very mixed equation that comes out in this from these different districts. So as Longshebeni and her team conclude, despite continued cultivation of indigenous crops, the main trend is a shift towards commercial crops, which, as they point out, raise concerns about the loss of crop diversity and hence agrobiodiversity. This again relate to a gradual decline of shifting cultivation, Hume cultivation as it's known in Northeast, where farmers could have up to 20 to 40 different varieties of crops in a single field. Such diversity would, of course, not be there in a plantation with single commercial crop like cardamom. In view of this, my interest in food sovereignty and possible role of heritage plant might seem misplaced, or that it goes against the grain of actual changes on the ground. Perhaps, but I still think the present also carry other opposing tendencies that is worth exploring. And I'm following a lot of sort of online forums from Northeast that people are, involved in organic farming and traditional food stuffs. And it's quite, there are such a rich genre. There's so many things seems to be going on in relation to food. And I just ran into this story about this young gentleman. It's a story about Ravallo, a 20-year-old entrepreneur belonging to the Pomai community who have started organic culture, his own organic farm, through which he seeks to promote a sustainable food sovereign way of life in his own home areas. And as we learned from a small article that I found through Facebook contacts, he has some in peace and conflict studies from TIS, and he has lived for several years in different big cities, but realizing that urban life never had much appeal to him. So he returned back home and now tried to learn the skill to farm, and is pursuing his interest in food and indigenous cuisine. It is stories like this one that I hope to follow more closely in this project, looking at the younger generation who seek to stay on the land or reconnect with the land. I guess this is an uncharted terrain. Okay. Now, I think for him and for many others, this is a sort of a difficult learning journey to acquire the skills and the knowledge to be a successful farmer. Knowledge of the plants that he has to learn from the elders, as well as those of his previous, combined with his previous experiences from the city. Although I can't keep, so in all this, I would just come back to saying, that thinking about plants in a way, it really point to how powerful, again, the story of the tea plant. You bring a plant from Assam over to Africa, but you completely change the landscape, as well as, the power that there are in these other traditional heritage plants. And I keep coming back to this beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass by plant scientist and Native American Indian scholar Robin Wall Kimmerer, pushing us to learn from plants. Through plants, she offers stories that are meant to heal our relationship with the world. So her work is an attempt to bring her scholarly way of knowing as a plant scientist with her indigenous way of knowing, learned from her elders. Perhaps this conference can continue such a conversation, allowing different ways of knowing and being in the world to meet and bring new insights into that can help us heal our damaged planet. Thanks for that. Thank you. I stop there.
I myself, I'm a hopeless fan of Assam tea, and growing up seeing the tea gardens whenever I travel by Assam, and also consuming Assam tea on a regular basis, but never really pondered that we could also look at plants, tea plant, for that matter, crops and seeds in the way that you have suggested. And I thought it was very insightful and interesting. Thank you very much. I'm sure your talk and analysis is going to open up many dimensions, particularly for many researchers who might want to embark on similar issues or concerns like this. So thank you very much for your talk. And to elaborate the discussion further, I shall now invite Professor Ajailu to please share her remarks and also to take the discussion forward. Professor Ajailu, please.
Thank you, Benny, and thank you so much, Professor Carlson, for your wonderful lecture. It's a learning experience for me to connect food and Northeast migrants. Currently, I'd like to share with you that I'm working on a paper on food and identity among the Indian diaspora women in North America with Professor Prakna from University of South Johannesburg, South Africa. So you've given me a lot of new ideas. I feel that, you know, understanding tea plantations and ethnic communities in Assam have kind of given us a new, a nuanced understanding of how the tea goes transnational in this globalized world. Tea gardens in Assam have made the reason visible to the outside world, which you rightly pointed out, especially in England earlier, and also to other parts of Europe, and now to Africa. Interestingly, in colonial writings, tea was perceived as a civilized food beverage. But the tea workers, the plantation workers in the tea garden or in the coffee plantation garden were considered as uncivilized savage, just like the Naga tribes were considered as uncivilized savage, you know, and they have been excluded from the mainstream society. And very interesting, in Assam, the tea garden workers were labeled today as tea tribes, and in the colonial writings as the coolies, and try to, you know, kind of nullify their identity. And they were discriminated against and exploited since they were illiterate for decades. Although today in 2020, 2021, we came to know that a few percentage of them, probably 5% or 10% of the younger generation, are into education. And I think a few of them have now entered into colleges and university, but a huge majority of them still remains illiterate. And interestingly, the Assam movement never speak about this tea tribal struggles or the Adivasi struggle and their movements. Assamese people never want to accept this tea tribes or Adivasis as a part of the larger Assamese imagination. And so it's a very interesting talk that you've given connecting to the Assam tea issues, and amazing that all tea came from Assam in Kenya. This is an eye-opener for many of us who haven't done research, empirical research. And great to know that you're doing a project with your colleague. Looking forward to read your work after a few years once you complete. And interesting that seeds were taken from Northeast all the way to Africa. And I also feel that the new trends, in interdisciplinary research, multidisciplinary research now in India with National Education Policy 2020, and also in my University of Hyderabad, we have been given this prestigious Institute of Eminence, and we are heavily kind of encouraged and pushed to do interdisciplinary research. And your talk today has given a new opening for us, where social science in particular, in collaboration with life science or chemistry or physics or biochemistry, is to look at food studies, and India, as you know very well, since you've been working for decades in India, we have been debating about food politics rigorously, and at the same time, scholars, particularly social scientists, began to look at food studies very critically. So your talk is very much in app, and I must also say that food is often perceived and understood as an important aspect that connect us to a region, to a tribe, to our family and kinship, and also our identity. I think Dolly Kikon and you have written in your article about this, and there was a movie called Axion, which we all know, which revolves around akuni, the fermented fish, and the bamboo shoot, and then the pork. So food in the Northeast migrant experience is often associated with nostalgia, with memory of their excluded region. People from the Northeast always feel that they are the stepchildren of Mother India. And you have highlighted wonderfully. And you've also highlighted about the controversial in the government of India's proposed plant of palm oil plantation in the Northeast. And I do follow up the recent protests expressed by the concerned leaders, especially Chief Minister Conrad Sangma and his sister Agatha Sangma, who clearly pointed out in a written form to the central government about the ecological imbalance and negative impact of the biodiversity because of this palm oil plantation. So let's watch and see how things will move in the next few months. And I also would like to share with you that my colleague Meena Khandelwal and Uday Kumar from University of Iowa, where I did my postdoctorate, have identified the hill women in India who often collect firewood were causing deforestation. And they look at an alternative of a cook stove, and also livestock in mind, and they try to examine the interconnection. Deforestation is a big issue, and the meat industry, which you also mentioned in brief about meat, as a food habit in the Northeast, was in high demand. Now there is a significance to study about consumption of meat, and also, as you know very well, reverence for cow in India, to be more precise. Now, I just would like to take another 2-3 minutes in a discourse on the contribution of indigenous knowledge in the kind of ecological production of food, or agro-ecological production of food, particularly organic food, which you just mentioned about the young Maram man who studied here in the metro city but went back to his village and started his organic farm. I mean, it is critical to ask whether academicians like you and me and scientific community accept this indigenous knowledge as an alternative form which contributes to alleviate hunger and create food security, and also give nutritional look into nutritional deficiency. See, indigenous knowledge systems, particularly from the tribal communities of the hills of Northeast, have never been systematically recorded in written form earlier. So I'm so excited that you are doing this project. I do understand that there is a kind of proliferation of the indigenous knowledge system in various parts of the world, but in the Northeast, it is still in its baby stage, in its infant stage. And the role of indigenous knowledge, in my opinion, in preserving the flora and fauna or the biodiversity in the forests in the Northeast is extremely important for the local tribal community. and indigenous knowledge about plant genetic resources is extremely important in the search for new methods to conserve, to preserve, and use these resources to benefit the tribal communities. And I also would like to mention that agroecological agriculture contributes to sustainable development in various forms. And we all talk about how, agriculture needs to be sustainable. In which organic is one system, organic farming is one system. And that support startup farms like you mentioned about these young men. And I personally know a lot of Naga young boys, young men and young women in Nagaland who have now started exporting Rajamirchi, hottest chili in the world. I know from my own community who's a young man whose father is a top police officer. I asked his father who came and visited me and my husband here in Hyderabad just before COVID lockdown. He's one of, yeah. So he said, well, my son is exporting Raja Mirchi, King Chili. I was like, oh my goodness. And it just connected me to the day when I was in San Francisco in 2014 and saw in a departmental store this Raja Mirchi, probably around 4 pieces, if I remember, for $2.5. That shows how globalized, local and global. That is, globalization is taking place today. It's no longer globalization, but we're talking of globalization. And another thing that I just want to mention is that there is a scarcity of arable land. And most critically, land has become acidified, making it less fertile. So I mentioned to you before the program started about my close collaborator, Dr. Suri Sehgal, one of the finest seed agricultural scientists in the world, who studied in Harvard University in the 1950s. He's also a philanthropist who funded my project on women's feminine hygiene in the 2 biggest slums in Hyderabad. He donated $100 to ICRISAT, International Crops Research Institute, for the semi-arid tropics in Hyderabad. And he said that the biggest problem here in India is soil degradation. And in India, we have around 161 million arable land under cultivation. But it is estimated that 100 million out of this 161 million arable land are in danger of production because of soil degradation. And it's extremely important for us that we pay immediate attention, especially those who are agricultural scientists and those who are doing research on agriculture and seeds like you now. I think it's important to pay immediate attention to improving quality of soil. And my collaborator, Dr. Suri Sehgal, also said that the key problem in agriculture, which we must tackle, is to do plant breeding, like the way agricultural scientists do here in Hyderabad, in ICRISAT. But we need to pay lots of attention to the structure of soil and manage our water sources, because unless we manage our water sources, we are in big trouble. And he also pointed out how the variety of good seeds, you talk about tea seeds from Assam exporting to Nairobi and Kenya, other parts of Kenya. Good seeds alone cannot help, as it is just one component. Sunlight is required. Secondly, we need to focus on sustainability of production and not overproduction, but requires integrated approach. So I think, in my opinion, we need sunlight, we need soil, good soil, we need water, we need seeds. These are all important for agroecological production of food and make for sustainable agriculture. And another thing that I want to kind of mention is how soil in the Northeast, in certain parts of Northeast, are acidic, so is in other parts of India. And we need to neutralize it by making it by mixing it with organic soil. I do little kitchen garden, so I know a bit about acidity and organic. I grow my own food in my little kitchen garden, so I do learn a bit, although as I mentioned, I haven't done any empirical field work, but I do my own experiment for my little kitchen, because I'm very health conscious today in this COVID time. I think health is our asset. We are all so much concerned about building our immunity by eating organic food. And so I feel that plants are also like you and me, like humans. I think if if we humans are too much into acidic food and make our body acidic, I mean, how we live an unhealthy life. So I'm very particular that, we drink alkaline water, we eat alkaline food to neutralize the body. And similarly, in my opinion, the soil also needs that alkaline and other nutrients, magnesium, potassium, nitrogen, and so many other things. I also would like to end by stating about my encounter with a man who is Professor Ram Reddy's son. Ram Reddy is a former vice chancellor of Osmania University. In memory of him and his contribution, the Osmania University has named their distance education as Professor Ram Reddy's education. Distance education. His son happened to fly with me in Indigo flight from New Delhi to Hyderabad a couple of years ago. And we strike a conversation in the flight for 2 hours. And to my surprise, he's well dressed. He looks like one of the CEOs of a multinational company. And he said he's a farmer. I said, Ramesh, please don't joke at me like that. He pulled out his visiting card, and I found he's indeed a farmer in South Africa. And I met another Telugu agricultural scientist in the University of Iowa campus in 2013 when I was pursuing my postdoctorate. And she shared that many Indian diaspora are investing in agricultural land for farming in Africa. So Africa, I think, is the next destination for supplying food to different continents around the world. And indigenous people have to preserve their land, preserve their soil and water sources carefully, and not allow the capitalists to come into their areas. And lastly, I strongly feel that even tourism in this indigenous area should not be encouraged, because I strongly feel that it will affect the biodiversity, increase pollution like we have seen in Shimla, or in Missouri, and then eventually it harms the environment and harms the people who live there. So this is my brief comment, and thank you very much, Professor Carlson and Professor Benny, Dr. Benny, for giving me this wonderful opportunity.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Ajailu, for sharing your remarks and also for further supplementing the conference with your valuable insights and observations.